Gary Whitten, 64 years old, 31 years on death row. James Malden was murdered on October 10, 1990, and Gary Whitten was found guilty and given the death penalty. At a halfway house in Pensacola, where the two men were receiving alcohol treatment, Gary Whitten met James Malden in March 1989. Whitten and Malden continued to see each other after leaving the halfway home, usually during meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. Malden spent the night at Whitten's house on October 7, 1990, after arriving inebriated. The two guys traveled to Destin on October 8, 1990, so Malden could make a withdrawal from his bank. The man came back the next day because the bank was closed. When the bank teller informed Malden that he could not withdraw money without his passbook, which he lacked, Malden canceled his account. Because Malden was too drunk to accomplish it himself, Whitten helped him complete out the paperwork needed to close his account. Malden took over $1,000 out of the bank. The two men then booked rooms at a Destin hotel. Whitten used the fictitious license plate number on the hotel documents. Because of the mismatch in the license plate numbers, the hotel clerk noted it and entered the right details on the forms. At around 12 p.m., after checking in, Whitten departed the hotel, and he asserted he never came back. Whitten then admitted to the police that he did come back for a little period of time, but that Malden had already passed away when he got there. The hotel employee reported seeing Whitten's car come at around 10:30 p.m. and depart once more at around 12:30 a.m. Next day, Malden's body was discovered by the same hotel employee. Malden had several wounds, including stab wounds to the shoulder, cheek, neck, scalp, back, and heart. He also had a cracked skull. Malden had only some spare change on him when he died, according to police records, and tests showed that he had a 0.34 blood alcohol level at the time. On October 11, 1990, the hotel clerk informed the police that Whitten had provided fraudulent information on the hotel papers, and they summoned Whitten to the station for questioning. A pair of blood-stained boots that matched Malden's blood type were discovered during a search of Whitten's house. In his car, the authorities discovered bloodstains that also matched Malden's blood type. Whitten admitted to an inmate and was overheard by another inmate that he went back to the hotel to rob Malden and killed him because he was scared that Malden would testify against him in a parole violation hearing as a result of the robbery. Whitten was being held in jail awaiting trial at the time. Statements from both convicts attesting to this knowledge were provided. Dusty Spencer, 71 years old, 31 years on death row. For the murder of his wife, Karen Spencer, Dusty Spencer was found guilty and given the death penalty. Early in December 1991, Karen Spencer gave her husband Dusty the order to vacate their residence. Dusty questioned Karen about money she had taken from the bank account for their painting business on December 10, 1991. During the violent struggle that followed this argument, Dusty choked, beat, and threatened to kill Karen. After she called the police, they arrived and took Dusty into custody. Later, Dusty called Karen from behind bars and yelled at her. Since Christmas was close, Dusty was invited to spend the holiday with his family, but Karen asked him to leave after Christmas. Dusty admitted to his pals on New Year's Day that he had pondered drowning Karen by tossing her over his boat. He visited Karen's house once more on January 4, 1992, and they fought again. During their fight, Timothy Johnson, Karen's son, woke up and entered his mother's bedroom. Johnson claimed that Dusty was standing over Karen and striking her with a clothes iron. Johnson stepped in, and Dusty whacked him with the iron as Johnson went to his room. Karen left the house in search of help. Dusty removed the phone from the wall while Johnson was attempting to call for help. After leaving the residence, he also left the city. Tim Johnson and Karen Spencer were transported to the hospital, where a doctor determined that Karen's injuries were compatible with being struck by a clothes iron. Timothy Johnson overheard arguing on November 18, 1992, in the backyard. He went outside after taking a gun from his mother's room. He saw Dusty Spencer slamming a stone at his mother. He saw blood on Karen Spencer's face as well. Johnson claimed he attempted to shoot Dusty Spencer, but the gun malfunctioned. He used the gun's butt to strike Spencer in the head as a result. Karen's nightgown was then pushed up by Dusty. who also shouted filthy remarks and banged her head against a concrete wall. Johnson attempted to help his mother flee from Dusty while Karen begged him to stop. Johnson fled to a neighbor's house to get help after Dusty threatened him with a knife. When the police arrived, they discovered Karen lifeless. She had been stabbed 4 or 5 times in the chest, according to the police. She had also sustained defensive cuts to her wrists and arms, as well as blunt force damage to the head. Roderick Orme, 62 years old, 30 years on death row. Orme and Red were friends. On March 3, 1992, Orme made a call to Red at the motel where he was staying. Red was a nurse, and Orme called her because he had been freebasing cocaine and was experiencing a bad high. According to Orme's first and second statements, Red came at his hotel room sometime between 7 and 8:30 p.m. and between 9 and 10 p.m. Orme claims that Miss Red accidentally knocked the crack pipe out of his hand, resulting in the loss of his drugs. She also inserted a number of crack pieces into the toilet. Then Orme drove away in Miss Red's car while using her keys and handbag to go partying. Orme claimed that he had gone back to the hotel several times and that when he recognized something was wrong, it was still dark outside. However, he was unable to enter the room since he had left his key there. Orme did not acknowledge any involvement in the murder of Miss Red in either of his statements to the police. In the early hours of March 4, 1992, Orme arrived at a rehab facility in Panama City, Florida. He had received treatment at this facility for his significant history of substance misuse 1 year prior to this day. Orme was confused and unable to respond to inquiries that morning, yet he still managed to write down the name of the hotel. Orme was showing signs of delirious tremors and had a flushed complexion, all of which are signs of acute cocaine withdrawal. Cocaine was detected in Orme's blood, and for almost 30 hours he was in intensive care. Additionally, Orme had illegal barbiturates in his possession. Calling Lee's Motel, someone at the rehabilitation facility requested that room 15 be checked. The body of Lisa Red was discovered when the motel owner examined the room. She had been severely assaulted, and strangling was the manner of death. Kenneth Hartley, 56 years old, 30 years on death row. A witness stated that on 22nd of April 1991, the victim, Gino Mayhew, was selling crack cocaine outside of the victim's Chevrolet Blazer when Kenneth Hartley and 2 co-defendants, Ronnie Farrell and Sylvester Johnson, approached him. The witness saw Hartley pull Mayhew into the driver's seat while holding a gun to his head. Farrell slid into the front passenger seat, and Hartley took the seat in the rear, behind Mayhew. Johnson followed the Blazer out of the parking lot in a pickup. Police discovered Mayhew slumped in the driver's seat on April 23, 1991, suffering from 5 gunshot wounds, 1 to the forehead, 3 to the back of his head, and 1 to the shoulder. For the first-degree murder, robbery, and kidnapping of 17-year-old Gino Mayhew, Hartley and the 2 co-defendants, Farrell and Johnson, were each charged and tried separately. Farrell and Hartley were found guilty and given the death penalty. Johnson was also found guilty, but he was given a life term. Thomas Moore, 50 years old, 30 years on death row. Moore was found guilty of robbing, killing, and setting Johnny Parrish's home on fire. Parrish lived in the same area as Moore, and the 2 were close friends. On January 31, 1993, at 3 p.m., Moore and Parrish were drinking outside Parrish's home. Moore said in a statement that Clemens and Gaines, 2 local kids, approached the house. Earlier that day, he had observed the same 2 young people having a rifle. At the trial, Clemens refuted these incidents. Gaines and Clemens both attested to speaking with Moore about robbing Parrish. It was decided during this talk that Clemens would enter the house with Moore and Gaines would act as a lookout. Gaines said that he did not see Moore or Clemens enter the home, but that he heard 2 gunshots, saw Clemens leave the building, then come back in through the rear door. Gaines turned to leave the house, but Clemens followed him and informed him that Moore had shot Parrish. In his testimony, Clemens claimed that after entering the home with Moore, Moore pulled a revolver on Parrish. He shot Parrish because he refused to tell him where he hid his money when he asked him. When 2 neighbors observed flames pouring from Parrish's home, they rushed inside to save him. He, however, had passed away by this point. The fire inspector claims that there were two different purposeful fires started. Shorter, a witness, claimed that Moore instructed him to burn a bag of garments that he had brought him. He also claimed that Moore added that he had shot Parrish and set fire to his home. Moore made it clear that after shooting Parrish twice, Clemens fled the house and Moore used the lawnmower top that he had found to set fire to it in order to burn off any remaining fingerprints. Shorter dialed his mother's phone, who then made a police call. According to testimony from a prisoner, Moore claimed that he didn't intend to kill Parrish, but that he had no choice because he knew who he was. Another neighbor said that Moore had asked him to rob Parrish as well. Anthony Ponticelli, 56 years old, 35 years on death row. Ponticelli convinced two brothers they could conduct a drug deal by luring them to an isolated spot. The brothers were in the front seat and Ponticelli was in the back, making a total of 3 men in the vehicle. Ponticelli shot both of them in the back of the head during the journey. Ralph Grandinetti, 20 years old, passed away instantly, but his brother was still conscious, and Ponticelli struck him with the revolver to stop him from wailing. Ralph Grandinetti's body was discovered by authorities near the Silva Springs Mobile Home Park. 25-year-old Nicholas Grandinetti was rushed to the hospital, but he also passed away. Richard Randolph, 61 years old, 34 years on death row. Minnie Ruth McCollum was murdered, and Richard Randolph was found guilty and given the death penalty. Randolph used to work at a Handyway convenience shop in Patatka, which was run by Minnie Ruth McCollum. Witnesses Terry Sorrell, Dorothy Patilla, and Deborah Patilla saw Randolph shutting the front door of the Handyway convenience store on August 15, 1988, while he was wearing an employee shirt. Randolph was questioned by the women on the closure of the store and the whereabouts of McCollum. The women were informed by Randolph that McCollum had borrowed his vehicle since her own vehicle had broken down. He told the women that McCollum's car was fixed and that he was on his way to pick her up. He then walked out of the shop. The trash can was turned upside down, and the women saw the counter was a mess. They reported the incident to the sheriff's office over the phone. After receiving the call, a deputy entered the establishment by smashing a window. The deputy discovered McCollum, who was still breathing and wailing, lying on her back with blood dripping from her head and neck. From the waist down, McCollum was also exposed. The deputy quickly ordered her to be sent to the hospital. A surgeon named Dr. Kirby Bland testified that McCollum was unconscious when arriving at the hospital. He discovered that she had endured a brutal beating and many blows to the head. McCollum's face, neck, and scalp all bore severe wounds. McCollum had a shattered jawbone. She also sustained stab wounds close to her left eye and a knife wound to the side of her neck. 6 days after the tragedy, McCollum passed away from the severe head injuries. Richard Shear, 57 years old, 34 years on death row. For the murder of Drew Snyder, Richard Shear was found guilty and given the death penalty. In December 1987, the victim, Drew Snyder, was reported missing. On January 13, 1988, Richard Shear was approached by authorities as part of their investigation into Snyder's disappearance. Snyder was a friend of Shear. He waived his rights to an attorney, talked to the police about the murder, and led them to multiple areas where Drew Snyder was killed. Daniel Peterka, 56 years old, 33 years on death row. Daniel John Peterka was due to turn himself in to Nebraska authorities on February 11, 1989, to start serving 2 consecutive one-year jail terms for theft. Peterka told his fiancée at the time that he did not want to go to jail and that he wanted to get a job and start over someplace else prior to turning himself in. In late February 1989, Peterka made an appearance in Niceville, Florida. He moved in with Ronald LeCompte. The former bought Peterka a gun. Peterka and John Russell shared a duplex when they moved in April 1989. The two, according to witnesses, did not get along well. Peterka showed up at Thompson's place of business that evening, driving Russell's vehicle. He invited Thompson to a restaurant and stated that he was on the run and did not want to go to jail. Francis Thompson spent the night at the duplex before departing the following morning for work. On July 13, 1989, Russell skipped work that morning. Around 9 a.m., a coworker named Gary Johnson visited the duplex and reported seeing Russell's car in the driveway. When no one answered the door, the coworker was worried about Russell and allowed himself in through a window. When he found the gun, he noted that it was unloaded and that the couch's cushions were missing. After work, he came back and questioned Peterka regarding Russell. Peterka said that Russell had departed with someone the previous evening, but he denied knowing where he was now. Eventually, Peterka did admit to the crime. Police were contacted by Peterka, who admitted to forging Russell's signature on a money order and paying Russell $100 to use his identity. Russell began pushing Peterka while talking about the money order, and the two eventually got into a brawl in the living room. Peterka won as they both reached for the gun. Russell was inadvertently shot in the top of the head by the gun as he stood up from the couch. Russell was buried in a shallow grave after Peterka wrapped his body in a rug and took him to a remote area of the Eglin Air Force Base. George Treppel, 74 years old, 32 years on death row. George James Treppel was given the death penalty by the court for killing Peggy Carr. After consuming Coca-Cola from a tainted bottle that contained thallium nitrate, Peggy Carr became ill. Pesticides containing the hazardous ingredient thallium were outlawed in 1965. The compound is, nonetheless, extensively employed in the chemical production of methamphetamine. The same toxin also poisoned further Carr family members, but they lived. Investigators went undercover in search of information, and one of them had George James Treppel, Carr's neighbor, as his primary suspect. Treppel moved out a year later, and only then did the police search his house. An old bottle of thallium left behind in Treppel's garage was the case's missing piece, which the detectives were able to find. Robert Rimmer, 56 years old, 32 years on death row. Aaron Knight and Bradley Krause were killed on May 2, 1998 during a heist at an audiologic business in Wilton Manors, and Rimmer was found guilty of their murders. The victims were shot from point-blank range in a brutal manner. Rimmer and Kevin Parker entered the audiologic store in Wilton Manors, Florida, probably with the help of a third person. Bradley Krause and Aaron Knight were the two employees that were working that night. Rimmer and Parker instructed the two workers to lie face down on the ground before taping their hands together. Rimmer had a semi-automatic weapon at his disposal. 11 offenses, including a first-degree murder, armed robbery, armed kidnapping, attempted armed robbery, and aggravated assault, were brought against Parker and Robert Rimmer. Rimmer got the death penalty, and Parker received a life sentence. Anton Krozak, 64 years old, 31 years on death row. David Stocker was robbed and killed at his house by Krozak and his co-defendant William "Billy" Poirer. In Lee County, Texas, in September 1990, Stocker was choked by Krozak while Poirer kept his mouth and nostrils closed to prevent him from breathing. For around 10 minutes, Krozak choked Stocker before pouring drain cleaner and water down his mouth. Then Poirer tapped a washcloth inside Stocker's mouth. Stocker was placed in the bathtub as his ankles were shackled together by Krozak. They took over Stocker's pickup truck and loaded it with audio gear, 2 television sets, 5 rifles, a video recorder, and a revolver. On their way out to sell the stolen goods, they also loaded Stocker's body into the truck. His body was transferred to their car, which was parked down the street after they finished their appointment with the buyers. They proceeded to transport the body to a remote area in Charlotte County that Krozak had already scouted. For second-degree murder and robbery, Poirer received sentences of 35 years and 15 years respectively. Harry Jones, 64 years old, 31 years on death row. For a robbery and a murder, the state of Florida gave Jones a death sentence. Court records say that Harry Jones killed George Wilson Young Jr. in order to take his car. According to the medical examiner, Young drowned in fresh water, which is the cause of death. Young was alive when he was submerged, even though the medical examiner was unable to identify whether or not he was awake at the time he drowned due to plant matter that had become stuck in his neck and lungs. In addition to other wounds, the medical examiner found that Young had many shattered ribs and a fractured arm, which were consistent with pre-mortem defense wounds. Robert Consalvo, 61 years old, 30 years on death row. Consalvo was found guilty and given the death penalty for the murder of Lorraine Pezza on September 27, 1991. On the evening of September 21, 1991, Lorraine Pezza and her neighbor Robert Consalvo visited an ATM. Withdrawing $200, Pezza put $60 in her wallet and the remaining $140 in her glove box. After the two had gone back to Pezza's flat, she discovered she had left her $140 in the car around an hour later. She looked for her car keys but couldn't find them. Pezza used the backup key to unlock her car but found that her money was gone. When the police responded to her call, they questioned Consalvo. He denied any involvement in the keys or money being missing. He and the police left, but Pezza called the police and asked them to come back. She admitted that she believed Consalvo had stolen the money, but she refrained from saying anything out of fear. She also asked how she might file a complaint against him. Pezza hired a locksmith to replace the locks on her doors, mailbox, and car on September 27, 1991. The final person to see her alive was him. The teller's surveillance video captured Consalvo using Pezza's ATM card on the same day. He was also identified while operating a vehicle that resembled Pezza's. On October 3, 1991, Consalvo was seen entering Mirna Walker's apartment, Lorraine Pezza's downstairs neighbor. Consalvo was arrested after the police were called to the location. Police searched Consalvo and discovered Pezza's checkbook there. When a detective knocked on Pezza's door to ask her about the missing checkbook, no one answered. He placed his business card in her doorway with the request that she phone him as soon as she entered. Police broke into her apartment after her friends and relatives started to worry about her disappearance, and they found the detective's card still in her doorway. The decomposing remains of Pezza were discovered in the apartment. Troy Merck, 51 years old, 30 years on death row. Troy Merck Jr. was found guilty of first-degree murder and given the death penalty on September 7, 1993. On the evening of October 10, 1991, Merck went to a pub in Pinellas County with his friend Neil Thomas, who had traveled to Florida from North Carolina. A number of customers lingered in the parking lot after the pub closed at 2 a.m. Merck and Thomas were two of the patrons and witnesses who had been drinking heavily throughout the evening at the tavern. Merck and his partner were standing in the parking lot leaning against a parked car with several others inside. They were requested politely not to lean on the car by one of the passengers. Merck apologized sarcastically with his partner. James Anthony Newton came up to the car and started chatting with the people inside. After hearing Catherine Sullivan, a passenger in the car who had been drinking and was working as an off-duty bartender at the establishment, congratulate Newton on his birthday, Merck made a sarcastic remark to him. Merck tried to start a fight when Newton urged him to mind his own business, but Newton resisted. After approaching his vehicle and unlocking the passenger's side door, Merck removed his shirt and tossed it in the back seat. Once more approaching Newton, Merck started pounding him in the back. Sullivan tested that she observed bloodstains on Newton's back and a blade glimmer in the darkness. In her testimony, Sullivan claimed that she returned to the club and ordered the bouncers to dial 911. According to medical examiners, Newton died from multiple stab wounds, but the main fatal wound was to the neck. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.